people, it's really weird. You know, with some people, they say that, you know, when we're using TypeScript, you know, do I have to use it? Is it only for large projects and that kind of thing? And I think it's not now. You know, I think, and before, when we were learning about TypeScript and all that kind of stuff, when TypeScript was first introduced, then, you know, I think it was new and people were like, do I really need this? It's overhead, you know, it's extra work that I have to do. And I think now, I think it's required, right? And we talked about everyone else. How about the people online? We have some people online here. How are you feeling about TypeScript, JavaScript, React, and all those kind of things? And you guys can come on the line if you want to as well, if you're interested.
Sarah here.
Sarah?
Hey, I think for me, like, I still don't quite understand the syntax of TypeScript. And so I feel like sometimes the less I think about it, the more successful I am at the projects, instead of trying to figure out like the why and just like doing the work and thinking through the logic and then worrying about the kind of like syntax and details after to get it work. Do you know, get it working? You know what I mean?
I think it's a good observation. I think that, you know, when you first start off and you're learning JavaScript, and you guys did a little bit of JavaScript, like I said, last semester, then that was, it was kind of an intro to how to layer JavaScript on top of what you had here before with HTML and CSS. That's what you guys kind of did. And now with TypeScript, you know, when we think about what TypeScript is additional help. That's how I look at it. It's almost like it's helping you make JavaScript easier. It should. And believe me, if you try to do React without TypeScript, I always feel that that's just more difficult. Like that's me. I'm not saying you can't do it. You can do everything with just vanilla JavaScript. But I'd say, in my mind, I'm thinking, but why would I? That's like someone saying, I'm a hardcore programmer and I want to use Notepad++. I don't want to use Visual Studio Code. I don't want to use anything else. I want to remember all my code structures on my own and I want to just do it on my own. Why would you do that? I would never tell anybody to do that. And anyone who tells you that, like, you're not a good programmer unless you know how to do things, you know, from scratch or whatever. I always question that because I don't think that's true. I think it's like, you know, that's more like someone who is just, you know, trying to push you to do what they're doing. And I don't think that's really necessary. So TypeScript to me makes it easier. And that's why we've been doing it. Anyway, on that, thank you for that feedback. And we have to start finally. So we are COMP2112. That's advanced client-side scripting. I know it says JavaScript, but advanced client-side scripting in the fall 2022 semester at Georgian. And it's week 10 this week. Holy crap. I can't believe the time has flown by with us. I know we didn't really do 10 weeks because we've missed a couple of weeks because we're on Mondays and that sucks. But, you know, we have a lot of stuff that we've done, and let's talk about the things that we're going to be doing this week and how things are going. So last week was all around JSX. What is JSX? What is React hooks? The React router, we rebuilt our spa a little bit with React. And this week, I want to talk more about full CRUD. How do I do full CRUD with React? How do I do that whole thing? And there's a couple ways we can do it. I also want to talk about a couple of things in preparation for next week, which is the Fetch API and Axios. Okay, so those are two things that we're going to talk about, because without the Fetch API, connecting to an API at all on the back end is very challenging. So, and a lot of people use Fetch from the beginning, and we'll talk about what that is. So that's what we want to do. So last week again talked about well, let's just say last week's agenda. See what happens. This is me multitasking. We talked about all this stuff, and we talked about the state hook and the effect hook. That's what we did last time, and we did more on the React router And this week we're talking about just those two things: JavaScript, Fetch API, and Axios. And what is Axios? Okay. So first, I'd like to talk about the JavaScript Fetch API and what that is. All right. So the Fetch API, I want you to remember we did Ajax, and remember in Ajax where we actually did loading, and we talked about the asynchronous nature of JavaScript, and I said, I know I'm going to drive you crazy with this, but I'm going to say the asynchronous nature of JavaScript is half the problem, right? And so the Fetch API helps us, connect to data on another backend. So for example, let's suppose I want to connect to a backend framework, like how you guys are using, your backend, for you making a backend framework now with Rich, with .NET, right? You're making a backend API. What is it that you're using on the front end for Rich's .NET? Is it Blazor?
Yeah.
Sorry, right? That's what you're using, Blazor on the front end, right? So imagine if I can take that front end, Blazor, which is basically just another front end that's built into the .NET framework. I ripped it out. I'm not using that anymore. And I want to use just the back end, just the data piece. So, .NET connects to SQL Server, .NET connects to MySQL, .NET connects to whatever, and it's your back end. Or let's swap out back end. It's not .NET, now it's PHP. Or let's swap out the back end, it's Node, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later on this semester and next semester, right? You can swap out whatever you want, and think about, I have a bunch of data somewhere, like I have a bunch of data on a database somewhere with SQL or MongoDB, or even if it's a flat file and that we put it up. We need a way of getting to that data, and the back end is a way of doing that normally. You have some kind of PHP or .NET or whatever it's going to be, and it connects to your data. And then what we want to do is the back end is going to feed us the data. That's what it's going to do. It's going to say, hey, here's the data. And the data is going to come to us in JSON format. We're going to see JSON format coming from the back end, right? And what we want to do is we want to consume it. We want to eat that data with our front end. How do we eat that data? Well, we need to connect to it somehow, right? We need to connect the back end to the front end, right? And by the way, let's assume for now there's no authentication. Okay, that's another layer that we have to think about, right? So the first part is I want to be able to connect to the back end, no authentication, and get data. That's what I want to be able to do. Connect to the back end and get data, right? So I need to have some kind of mechanism to say, I need you to give me the data. And that is typically the Fetch API, right? So JavaScript produces this other API that allows us to do that, to provide an easy way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network, across the internet. That's what it does. And we normally would use an XML HTTP request, so Ajax, right? But Fetch is better because it's used by other technologies like service workers. And Fetch also provides a single place to define other things, like, for example, cores. Have you guys talked about cores with .NET and with Rich at all? Cores? Cross-origin resource sharing is what cores stands for, right? So cross-origin resource sharing is when I want to do something like I have two servers on the same box. Let's suppose you and I are going to build a server, right? And I have, normally like we build a PC. So I have a PC, I have a tower, and in that PC, I have different ports that I'm using. And one of them is for the back end, and I have another one, another whole other server that's running in the same PC, that's the front end. We have a problem, right? Because if there's technology, security that's out there that prevents you from sharing resources across the same network, like it's on the same box. And what we want to do is we want to say something like, okay, if I have my back end and my front end on the same network, right? I want to be able to do this sharing, between the two networks. The other thing sometimes that happens is if I want to grab things like images from the web, those kind of things. I want to grab images from the web, and I want to do it from an API, like let's say Flickr, as a good example. I want to grab images from Flickr or some other API that's out there, and I want to include those images in my website. Again, we're going to have this really weird cross-origin resource sharing security problem. And what Fetch does is it handles it for us instead of us doing it manually. So it handles all the header information, all those things that almost like communication protocol, to take care of that for us. Okay, now let's continue. So fetch, it differs from Ajax, jQuery Ajax, in a bunch of different ways. So here's the first one. We're going to use something called promises. This is a new thing that's built into JavaScript. So the way promises work is like this. I'm going to issue a request with fetch, right? So I say, hey, I want this resource. I want to get this data, right? And then what's going to happen is, remember in Ajax, what we had to do? We had to set up that kind of a for loop that says, if I have my ready state, is 200, or my status is 200 and my ready state is 4. I had to remember, I had to look for those two things in Ajax. I'd say, well, I'm ready. I have my ready state is 200. Everything is okay. And my, my status is 200 and my ready state is 4, which means I've got all my data. Now I can get that data from the server. The server's giving me all my data, right? That's what we used to do with Ajax. Remember? Can you recall? I know it's been a while back, but that's how we used to do it. We have to do this for loop to do that, or some kind of like event handler that we would have to wait and listen, right? Well, the problem with that event handler is we were stuck inside that place that basically said, here's our data. This is where we just got the data, so we can only have a function that goes from there. Right? We couldn't do it outside that function, because if I tried to, for example, when we were loading in our header and we made our manual spa, remember we did our little spa and I was loading in my header with Ajax, and then I'm like, well, the header didn't load yet. Why? Because we're trying to get the data before it's loaded, because of the asynchronous nature of JavaScript, right? We have to wait. Fetch handles this differently. It uses something called promises. And basically what it says is it promises to return the data, right? And it uses an asynchronous, protocol, so that we can sit there and say something like, okay, when this is done, right, do this. And you use something like called, there's a protocol that we use the then keyword. So do this, then do that. And the then keyword that we're going to use is like, we're waiting for something to be done. And then when it's done, then we're going to do something else. That's what it does. So it kind of it fixes our problem a little bit, right? As opposed to us making all those things that are happening. So, so here's another thing. So that's fetch. Now here is what fetch will look like. So here's fetch, right? So I'm just going to zoom in here so you guys can see this a little bit, just the code. So let's say, for example, I'm going to load something from a file, right? Or a location. Let's say our location is example.com, some website online, right? And we're going to load this movie's JSON file from that location. So the way it works is we have two then components for a fetch. Okay, I want you to see this. So first we go there and say, give me this data. This is the first request. And then, see how I said that? And then after I get that response, I'm going to take that response, right? And I'm going to return the response.json. I'm going to take whatever I get and I'm going to return, I'm going to JSONify. I'm going to convert that message that I'm getting from example.com movies.json, and I'm going to JSONify it, which means it's going to be in JSON format. I'm going to convert it to JSON from a string, because that's what I'm going to get back from them first. I'm going to convert it to JSON, and then this is the third line, and then I'm going to take that data, right, and I'm going to output it to the log. So there's like 3 pieces for fetch. Okay. And by the way, I'm going to tell you that I like fetch, but I like Axios more, because there's only 2 pieces. I don't have to do 3 things. It doesn't make sense. And I wish that JavaScript did it differently. And so this is why I use Axios compared to fetch. Could you use fetch? Yes, but why? Okay, and we'll talk about this in a second. Remember, just like, why would you use just vanilla JavaScript when you can use TypeScript kind of thing? So that's how it works. This is the promise. This is the idea of a promise. When I say, do this, and when I'm done, then do this. That's what the then method is, right? And notice we're using something called method chaining again, right? Method chaining means you have the first request, and then it's chained with a method. So connected with the dot access modifier here, right? The dot accessor. And then what we're saying is, okay, and then chain it again with another request. So it's one after the other after the other. So actually, it's one big line. I could write this in one line, right? Even though it looks like it's 3 lines. So it's just a weird way of looking at it. There's like three parts. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'd have to do for every resource I want to get, I need to do a fetch. I need to do these three lines every single time. Yep. It won't be in sequential order. No, it'll do whenever it feels like. That's another thing now. If I want to fetch things in order, oh, that's another thing, right? We can never expect that it's going to have the same execution order as how you've written the code. Make sense? So I can write it this way, right? And the thens will help me because I'm going to get them back in that order. So, however, if I write multiple fetch requests, who knows? It's going to be asynchronous. So we don't know whenever the server decides to respond, right? Especially if you have two different servers you're connecting to. Let's say there's a server over on the left and a server on the right. I'm just using left and right as an example. And then I want to get this server on the left first, and then this server on the right second. You can't guarantee that. There's latency. It's going to go through the web. It's going to go through a bunch of different hops to get to there. Who knows when they're going to give it back to you, that data, right? So that's the problem. And programmers get tripped up like that because they're like, well, I want it to be in this order. Well, then you have to code it that way, which is another way. You'd have to use another event. You have to make your own little events. What? Exactly. You have to make your own little event to basically say, okay, I'm only going to do this part when this is done. Then do this, right? Now you could layer it too. Here's another thing you could do. You could do one fetch inside of another fetch. So instead of then returning data, like the third line here, what you could do, if you wanted to do fetches in a row, you could layer it in here. You could say something, okay, well, now that I've got the data from here, now do another fetch in here. That's what you could do for sure. Because remember, these things here, what they are, they're just callback functions. We're just using arrow functions here instead, but you can do it in any one of these places. You could do another fetch request, no problem. Because that's another, it's almost like a function within a function call. That's all you're doing. You're layering it that way. And that's probably how you would handle what you're saying, Elena, if I had to do it in order. I would have one fetch inside of another one, probably. Easiest way. So, so the simplest use takes on this, kind of one argument. And let's take a look at the fetch API here, because I can talk all I want about fetch, but I want you guys to actually see what it looks like. I'm just going to bring this over. So if I actually look at the fetch API, right? And again, a great resource is the developer.mozilla.org, right? It really talks about exactly these things. So fetch interfaces, right? We have fetch itself, which is the method used to fetch a resource, right? There's a request response. We've talked about requests and response before because request response is the way we do a full, a round trip is what probably Rich would be calling it, where we do a request to the server, and then we get the server does something in the background, and then it comes back with a response. That's round trip. Does a round trip. So request response, and it talks about the compatibility. Now you can see that fetch is, even though it's a new API, fairly new, it's kind of compatible across every browser for the most part, as well as Node.js. So you can use it within Node as well, which is pretty cool. There are some things that are not available, right? But for the most part, everything that you see here is good. Also, remember, whenever we use a new API, it's always good to, to check to see if it's compatible and if it's working, right? Does that make sense? So you always should check to see if it's compatible. All right, so this is the fetch API, and it says using fetch, right? So that it talks about this exact thing that I talked about here, and then it also shows us supplying fetch requests. So this is where I would say always look to your documentation online to think about what it looks like. Okay, that's where you get the fetch request from, or information about fetch. All right, on that. Oh, sorry, one more thing. If I go back here and I type in can I use, right? caniuse.com. And if I type in fetch, always good to do, then it shows you backwards compatibility as well. So for example, you can see that older versions of Chrome, really old, didn't support it. Okay. So you can see that was, November 2014. That's the last time that didn't support fetch. It's been a while since you can use it. Here, you can see later on, Edge only picked it up in 2015, and Safari again was in 2016. So you can see that nowadays they're all supporting it except for Poor IE, right? Which of course is decommissioned anyway. So, or Opera Mini, but for the most part, it's available everywhere. And remember, when you look at the stats up here, this is available globally. What does this look like globally? 97% compatibility with anything we do here. So remember, whenever you look at an API, it's always good to understand how compatible is it for most browsers? Because remember, your browser is the window into your world. Without the browser support, then who cares, right? So this is where I would go with first. And if you look at it, here's the Fetch API. So this is Fetch itself, and this is the Fetch API. And you can see again that from 2015-ish, most browsers started to use it, and it talks about where to do it. Now, there's other ones. If you actually look through, there's other things that are that have Fetch attached to it, and for the most part, it's around the same compatibility level. Okay, but there are some parts of the Fetch API, as an example, that's either deprecated or something that they've been working on. So take a look. Right, I think it's a worthwhile thing to look and see what it looks like. Okay. All right, so that is kind of Fetch in a nutshell, starting off. Right, that's how you do it. So again, we have the response object that's up here. So this is the response object here, and the response object it does not directly contain actual data. Okay, what we're doing is we're changing the data into JSON. By converting it. That's what we do with the response object, okay? So that's the first promise. So there's two promises here. There's the first promise, that's the first promise, and then there's the second promise. The second promise is the way we have the data now. After it's been converted, now we have the data, right? So that's how it works. And when I say promises, I want you to think about something else. And I'm just gonna talk about it. I'm sorry, I'm gonna treat you all like a computer scientist for 1 second, okay? So please bear with me and don't get mad, okay? But I'm going to talk about what I've talked about before, which is design patterns. So if I go object-oriented design patterns, right? So you look it up. Then remember there was this book that I talked about. So this book right here, which is Design Patterns, that was brought up in the 1990s, 1994. I think I talked about this with you guys, right? And these guys, these four people, remember they state, just as a review, they talked about 23 design patterns that all programmers should know. It's almost like, I don't know, the DNA of programming, if you will, with object-oriented code. They talked about 3 types of design patterns: creational, structural, and behavioral, those 3 types, okay? And again, this is just looking at Wikipedia, but who cares, right? If I go down and talk about those 3 types of design patterns, you can see that creational, you might recognize some of this stuff. The factory design pattern, which is what we've been using so far, by the way. Every time I say something like, give me this, or create this, or create an element, if I create an element in JavaScript, I'm using a creational design pattern, which is a factory. You don't know the underpinning stuff inside the call that you're making when you say create element. You don't know what's happening. Someone wrote that code for you. It's a black box. It's a factory. You're making whatever object you want. The factory outputs widgets, outputs elements. That's what it does. So that's what the factory is. Singleton, if you think about it, is a global variable. We use singletons everywhere when we're coding, as well as other things that you might see here as well. One thing I wanted to talk about is behavioral. And one of the behavioral things that we've seen, what you're seeing right now, is something called the observer pattern. So the observer pattern, and I got to talk about this because you're going to see the same observer pattern later on with Rich, okay, and Angular next semester, right? So what the observer pattern is like this. I have something called an observer, okay? So this is the UML diagram. Let's take a look at this UML diagram for a second. And the reason why I want to share this with you, because I think it's really valuable, okay? So I have the subject, the thing that's being observed, okay? That's what I'm doing. And what I'm having is this observer, and the observer basically is looking at the subject, whatever is being observed, and the subject itself has something a method that's called notify observers. So the observer, we can say, subscribes to the subject, something that I'm looking at, almost like a magazine subscription service. I want you to think of it this, guys, okay? You and I subscribe to a computer magazine or a web design magazine together, right? And it's an e-zine, which means it's going to be online. Whenever the magazine publishes a new article, you get notified through email, right? Let's suppose. It's exactly the same thing that's going on with Fetch. Fetch is your observer, and the subject is the API, the server online, okay? That's what's happening. And the server, Fetch, is subscribing to the changes on the server. And when the server changes something, it's going to notify its subscribers. Fetch makes you, your code, the subscriber, right? So it notifies you when there's a change, okay? Let's take it a step further. I have a button on the browser. I have a button on the browser, okay? And on the button on the browser, I click the button. Observer pattern, right? My mouse is waiting. It's waiting for me to click on the thing, right? When the button is clicked, the event listener notifies its subscribers, the event handler, that the button has been clicked, the observer pattern. So I want you to always think about this, that there's someone who wrote this thing, and there's some thoughts that were put into this thing, because remember, JavaScript was written around this time, 90s, right? And they brought that in there. All programming languages today, C#, JavaScript, C++, Java, Python, whatever, use the observer pattern when it comes to event handling. Every single one of them, right? Now, some of them use it more effectively than others, but for the most part, that's another conversation. So why am I bringing this up to you? Why do I want to confuse you with the observer pattern? No, I don't. But I want you to understand the underpinning reasons why we do the things that we do, and what are promises? Promises are using the observer pattern, right? The promises, what they're doing is underlying. You're going to see that I'm listening for a change. I'm subscribing to my server, my API. And then as a subscriber, the server is going to publish this new data, and it's going to notify the subscribers that it's done so. And the notification process is going to be done whenever the server wants it to be done, which means it's going to be asynchronous. This idea is what I want you guys to take away from this, because next semester, you're going to see the exact same thing with Angular. The exact same thing, right? Okay. Any questions around the observer pattern? I know it's a 2-second example. By the way, normally when we teach the observer pattern, it's a whole day, just observer pattern. We make examples of the observer pattern, blah, blah, but this is not the exercise here today, so we're going to move on. All right, so again, let's think about how this fetch thing works, right? So we have, a function, right? And we call this function post data. We pass in a URL, and this is an example of a implementation for posting data, okay? Remember, there's two types of interactions we're going to have with the server, right? We're going to have a post request, and we're going to have a get request. We talked about this. A post request is going to ask for we want to change something in the data typically, okay? A get request is like, if I want to go to a website, let's say, for example, I want to go to your website that we just made, right? Your portfolio site, and I want to see your bio. I make a get request, right? Through the server, and the server basically responds with your page. Hey, there's the bio page. There's the about me, right? That's a get request. The post request is used if I want to make something like, I want to log into your private area of your web page that gives, that allows me to, I don't know, do something like I have some kind of dashboard that your page allows me to go to. I log in. Any kind of authentication, when I actually do the logging in process, that's a post request. I want to process your request, post request. So here we're processing a request to fetch data, right? The method is post. Here it is. The mode is CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, right? I can say if there's cache or not. I can pass in a header. This is a page header, right? That's how that works. And all this kind of stuff is something that I can have in something called a response object. This is the response object itself, right? And this is the post data method, all right? This is just something that I'm wrapping up with my fetch request, right? So that is, as an example, it can do all of this thing for me, right? As opposed to what we're doing now. Here's what's happened. Take a look here. I'm actually wrapping up from here to here. Here's the actual fetch request. Here's the fetch request. So we're using a new pattern that we got to talk about called async await. Okay. Again, do I need you to know this, all the intricacy of all this? No, I don't. But I want you to listen to the words and I want you to hear them for the first time, and then we're going to do them, and then you're going to get it. Okay. So I want to do an await request. An await means I wait for fetch to finish doing its business, and then afterwards I'm going to get a response. That's how fetch works. I want to do an await. And I'm going to do this whole function here, it's going to be asynchronous. We're marking it as asynchronous, which means I'm letting JavaScript know that I don't expect it to respond right away. It's not going to give me an error if I don't get a return type, right? That's what it's going to do. So it's async await. I'm going to make an async function on the outside, and I'm going to mark the inner function as an await function, which is, the fetch request. And then fetch has all this additional stuff that I can tell it to do, right? Here's what I can tell it to do. All this stuff is the first parameter of fetch. I can be very specific and give it more detail other than just the URL. In the previous example, just to go back one step, right? In the previous example here, we did this. Here's the URL, right? And we went right into the promise. This is the promise part, right? In this example of using fetch, right? We didn't do that. We have fetch here, we have fetch here, right? And here is the URL, example.com would go here, right? But instead of doing a promise first, we give it another parameter. And this parameter is an object that defines some configuration details. The type of fetch request I want to make a post type request, right? The mode that I'm going to use, and a bunch of other things, okay? And then the second parameter is what happens when after I'm done this request, okay? And a bunch of other, there's also an actual third parameter that we have here and a fourth parameter. So there's a bunch of extra parameters that fetch can take. It's more complicated, but the basic thing that we're doing is the thing you saw earlier, which is, here's my URL when I'm done, this is what I want to do, okay? So fetch is pretty complex. So it might look something like this: post data, which is the wrapper, this wrapper function that I'm calling. I'm passing in example.com and I'm going to the answer subdomain, right? And I'm passing an answer. And basically what's happening is the URL is that. So it's going to say example.com/answer, right? And then the second parameter that I'm getting is my data. My data is the answer that I'm looking for, which is 42, right? So I go in, that's the data that I get. The data is something that I'm going to pass into the fetch API. Here's the fetch API right here, right? Where I pass in, I tell fetch that I want to stringify the data that I get out in the body of my request. There's the data. So data comes in, that's 42, goes into my function, and then fetch does something with it. Okay. And then I have my first promise. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that data and I'm going to output it to the log. And so here I've actually cut it down to one promise, not two, right? Because I'm doing all the heavy lifting inside of my little wrapper function called post data. Yay, isn't that awesome? I think it's too complex. That's what I think. When I looked at this in the first time, I was like, holy crap, are you kidding me? I have to do all this legwork? I might as well just use Ajax, right? I'm serious, right? When I first looked at this, I was like, okay, thank you very much for this. But I mean, I could write my own function like that does all this work, right? So I like fetch. Please don't get me wrong. I like fetch. I think it makes life a little easier for us in some ways. Maybe this is a little easy for me because I understand how this works. But for the average developer, when they start looking at this, they're like, it's still a little bit cumbersome. It still gives me a lot of bells and whistles, maybe that I don't need to think about, right? Is there an easier way? And there is Axios. Axios is a third-party application that's very popular now. And it uses something called a promise-based HTTP client for Node.js and the browser. So we're going to be doing that. It is isomorphic, which means it can run in a browser and Node.js with the same code base. That's awesome, right? So, and on the server side, it uses the native Node.js HTTP module, while on the client, the browser, it uses the XML HTTP request, which is XHR, which is like Ajax, right? So it's really, really, I would say, versatile, flexible as a framework. And let's take a look at Axios for a second, because Axios is written by somebody else. It wasn't written by, it's not built into JavaScript, right? And if I was to look at Axios for a second, here's Axios, right? Let's take a look at it, okay? And what it does. So it's actually uses the ECMAScript module pattern when we include it. We have to download it just like we did everything else with Ajax, sorry, with Yarn or with NPM. We download it and install it into our package.json module, right? And for the most part, it looks just like this. There's one then, it's not two. And when we get our whatever we get from the user, we get our data right away. That's it. That's how easy it is. And my friends, that's why I like to use it, because for me, it's all about ease of use. It's all about ease of use, right? It's not something that I want to work hard. I don't want to work hard to fetch my data. I want one little command to do it for me, right? Because let's face it, we're busy people, right? And here's something else. Axios is written by someone else that's done a very, very good job. They probably wrote it better than I can write it. So why would I try and rewrite that or try and use some custom code or whatever with like as a wrapper? It doesn't make any sense, right? So if you go here to get started and it talks about what Axios is, it talks about how to install it like normal with Yarn, which we're going to do. You can also use the content delivery network. You can do that as well. So you don't have to install it kind of locally. If you don't want to, you can have Axios work. So it's connected to your browser in different ways. Remember, you can work on the browser and it can work within a framework like React. Okay. And I call React the framework because that's what it is. I'm sorry. At least nowadays. And then if you look at the API, like we've seen before, it kind of looks like this, where you have Axios, you use the keyword Axios, and then it says, here's the method. Again, way simpler. When I want to have a post and the data that I want, I can still qualify the Axios with a post or GET request, no problem, but it's way simpler. Like the syntax is like by far easier to use than a fetch request. And this is why we use it, okay? So going back to that, then I've kind of put the highlights here inside of our PowerPoint document. So here's an example of a GET request. I say, I make a new Axios reference. You can use the require format, or you can also use the ECMAScript module pattern. So you can use import Axios as an example. And then once you do that, that will be this line. Then you can say, well, Axios.get, right? So that's your GET request. Isn't that a beautiful thing? I don't have to tell it more specific things. I can say, I want to make a GET request. Wonderful. And then when I do the GET request, right, I can do something. And it also has a catch, just in case there's an issue. So do a fetch, and if there's a problem getting the data, here's a little catch promise that will actually do all your error handling for you. Built in. Guys, this is a beautiful thing, right? So it's a wonderful way of doing things. That's why I'm saying Axios is the way to go. When I compare Axios to fetch, it's just I wish fetch was Axios, put it that way. I wish JavaScript said, wow, we need to make this much easier for programmers and made it like this. By the way, I wish JavaScript was like TypeScript, all right? And I wish it was just easier for programmers. And anyway, you know where I'm getting at, right? Okay, so that's the GET request type. We're going to use this maybe today if we have time. And here's a post request. Post request, remember, I'm logging in. I have first name and last name. I use a post type request. And when I'm done logging in, then I can output. If I have a problem, then I can output the error. It's pretty simple. And it's super, super easy to understand how to use. Okay, questions around fetch versus Axios. I know that you don't see it yet because, talking about it and doing it are two different things. Until we actually do it with code, then it's like, woo-wah, I don't understand, right? And we're going to do this right now. Okay. All right. So, so this is great. And this is an opportunity for us to do this. I'm going to stop recording this one. This is Axios. And I'm going to go right into the demo portion of what we're doing today for your in-class exercise. Okay. So on that, I'm going to stop recording.